afferent and sensory signals. So again, you have your stimuli, you have these receptor neurons, and then they depolarize using these ion channels or some other protein receptors. This generates action potentials. So when this generates action potentials, these can be passed across synapses and by using neurotransmitters or sometimes electrical synapses. But basically, you have neurons passing electrical signals to each other via chemicals or ion channels, and then these are called polysynaptic pathways, and these reach the central nervous system. But the thing is that where is your central nervous system? Or what makes up your central nervous system? You have your spinal cord and brain, right? So this is what the actual path happens, or this is kind of like showing you a little more the path of how these sensory signals travel. Again, going from the stimuli through these receptor neurons, but now it's going up into the CNS. So this is what again, these polysynaptic pathways, they're going up. Now, when you go, these are the three main pathways I want you to know in terms of sensory pathways. You have the spinal cerebellar, spinal thalamic, and the dorsal column. And so what do you call it when someone's going up a staircase? And let's ask the chat. If someone goes up a staircase, do you call it ascending or do you call it descending? And no, I'm going really fast, but again, I'm trying to get to some really good stuff later. Yeah, ascending, right? Yep, so ascending. So this is why we call all of these pathways ascending pathways, because they're going up into the CNS. So this is why I kind of showed that previous figure. They're going up into the CNS. All right, so then the spinal cord. And remember when we talked in chapter 13 about all these white columns? So we're only showing a cross section, but what these are actually are, remember, which is white and which is gray matter. The gray matter is all the cell bodies, but the white matter is all those axons covered in myelin. So even though we're only seeing a cross section here, what if you actually showed all those axons, you have multiple of these axons running up and down the length of these columns. So this is why they're called columns, because you have all these axons forming this sort of like this structure that has a lot of myelin. That's why they're white. Okay, so then the three main ascending pathways, the posterior column, the spinal cerebellar, and the spinal thalamic. Now these subdivisions, I think I'll leave that for your advanced anatomy and physiology and nursing and medicine classes, but don't worry too much about it for this intro level. Okay, so this is a spinal thalamic pathway, and this is where does it go from? Well, you have these sensory signals being carried by these neurons to the spinal cord, so that's where the spinal part comes from. And where does it go up to? Well, it goes up past the medulla oblongata, past midbrain, and ends up at the thalamus up here. And hey, what do you have when you mash them together? You have the spinal thalamic pathway. So this is why it's ascending. It's going from the spinal cord up to your thalamus. So again, this is ascending. Okay, so that's one of the sensory pathways. Now spinal cerebellar. Well, it's still going to the spinal cord over here. But where is it going now? Well, where does it say in the second half of that word? Well, spine to cerebellum. Put them together and you have spinal cerebellar. So these make sense. Again, it's going from spine to thalamus, spine to cerebellum. They're both ascending. Now that third pathway, I want you to know for sure, posterior column pathway, sometimes called dorsal column. Again, posterior and dorsal, they're synonymous in humans. So you might see both depending on your textbook. But again, where is it going? Well, it's still going from the spinal cord, but it's going up to the thalamus up here. So why not call it spinal thalamic? Well, the reason why you don't call it spinal thalamic is that it's already reserved. So here was the anterior of the spinal cord cross-section. Here's the posterior. Now the posterior column pathway has axons that run along the posterior part of the spinal cord. But the thing is that you already have a spinal thalamic pathway, but the fibers that run along that pathway are on the anterior. So this is, for lack of a better explanation, spinal thalamic is already reserved, so you just have to call it the posterior column pathway. But why can't you call it both? Well, again, they're in different anatomical locations. And we'll get to why they, so the other thing is that they also have different functions as well. And this stuff, well, more FYI, and if you're taking advanced classes, but definitely know spinal thalamic, spinal cerebellar, and posterior column. Now, first, second, and third order neurons. This is a more complex topic, and if you have the anatomy coloring book, I think they do cover this as well. And what they have is the spinal thalamic pathway. What they typically have are three, and I'm putting quote unquote main neurons linking stimuli. You have your first order neuron detecting the stimuli, and then carrying it. So there are three neurons that carry from the stimuli all the way to the primary somatosensory cortex. And the posterior column pathway, you have three main neurons, and the spinal cerebellar pathway, you have two main neurons. And why do I say main? Well, they used to think that there were only three neurons, period. Like three neurons, that's it. Just going from stimuli to somatosensory cortex. Then they found very smaller neurons in between. But so when I say main, there are three neurons in the spinal thalamic and posterior column that run most of the length, going from the receptor all the way to the CNS. And then for the spinal cerebellar, there are two main neurons that make up most of the length, going from stimuli to the cerebellum. Again, so don't take this. I mean, I don't know if I should ask if Dr. Merritt does test on those small other interneurons, but when you see first, second, and third, it means that what are the neurons that run most of the length, going from stimuli to the sensory cortex or the cerebellum. Okay, so what we have with the spinal thalamic pathway? Well, this is what's showing over here with all these different color coding. So the stimulus goes to the spinal cord. That is the first neuron. Then it goes up to the thalamus. That's what we see here in this white neuron over here. And then it finally reaches the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is why you call it first, second, and third order. So the stimulus carries to the spinal cord. That's the first stop. Then it goes up to the thalamus. That's the second stop. And then the third order means it goes from the thalamus to the final stop, the primary somatosensory cortex. And again, why did I say main neurons? Because histologists and anatomists, they always have to make things more complicated. They found small little neurons in between these first and second order neurons. Don't worry about it for this class. Just know they exist, but I want you to know what first, second, and third order neurons and where they came from. Okay, posterior column. Again, it's going to the first order neuron is going from the stimulus to the medulla oblongata. So notice that it's actually not stopping at that spinal cord root right here. It's actually going from up through that. So this is another difference between the spinal thalamic and the posterior column. Instead of stopping here in the spinal cord, it actually goes all the way up into medulla oblongata. Then it goes that's the first order neuron, then it goes to the thalamus, and then it goes to the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, 1, 2, 3. First, second, third. And then you have the spinal cerebellar pathway. Thankfully, very easy. Again, instead of having a third order neuron, it's pretty much two main neurons. So stimulus, it goes to the spinal cord, as you see here. Then it goes up into the cerebellum. That's it. 1, 2. And that's pretty much what I want you to know in terms of first, second, and third order neurons. How do they relate to the spinal thalamic, the posterior column, and the spinal cerebellar pathways? So again, spinal cerebellar, this goes to synapses at the spinal cord, then it goes up to the cerebellum. Pretty easy, right? And then spinal thalamic, it goes to the spinal cord, and then it goes up into the thalamus. That's the second order neuron. And then from the thalamus, it goes to that primary somatosensory cortex. So it is part of the parietal lobe, and it's behind and posterior to the central sulcus. So that's why it's called the postcentral gyrus. Remember, a gyrus is a raised fold. So the part that's behind that central sulcus, that is the postcentral gyrus. That contains the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is the part that tells you, okay, what's touching me, how does it feel, so that's where you get that primary somatization sensations. And posterior column, again, a different pathway. it goes up to the medulla oblongata instead of synapsing at the spinal cord level of the spinal cord. It goes up to the thalamus either way, and the thalamus relays it to the somatosensory cortex. Now, here's, if you don't like the anatomical, this is like a simplified schematic. So spinothalamic, again, going from stimulus all the way to the somatosensory cortex up here. So stimulus to the spinal cord, up to the thalamus, that relays it to the primary somatosensory cortex. Posterior column, similar, but instead of synapsing at the spinal cord, it goes up to the medulla oblongata, still goes to the thalamus, and then goes to the primary sensory cortex. And the spinocerebellar, pretty simple. You just go from stimulus to the spinal cord to the cerebellum. So again, they're all ascending pathways. They're all going up